All right, let's get started. My name is Morgan Greenleaf. I'm the director of Innovation Catalyst, which is a program within the Georgia CTSA that helps early stage innovators. And I help run this Bench to Market talk that you're attending here on FDA regulatory strategy. This series, the Bench to Market talks, is sponsored by Biolocity, the Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, and by the Georgia CTSA. First, just a couple resources that are available to you out there in the community. The first is legal office hours, always very helpful. These are put on by Biolocity in partnership with the Emory School of Law. You can make an appointment here. It is free legal advice. They will not write contracts for you, but they will definitely give you advice as an early stage company. So please take advantage of that. Biolocity also offers pro bono innovation office hours. So these are with consultants in all kinds of different areas, including regulatory, and these are free. And so if you want to take advantage of these, you can contact Biolocity. And I'll drop some links as the webinar goes on so that you can access those. Next is a great opportunity with an organization called BARDA. So BARDA is a funding agency, part of the US government, and they will be coming to Atlanta on March 26, 2024 to talk to individuals in the Emory Georgia Tech ecosystem. And they are going to talk about their funding opportunities, and they're also going to have one-on-one networking meetings. I am intimately involved, as well as several people on the call, with the RADx program, which is a diagnostics program focused on COVID and infectious diseases. And many of the companies in that program have received funding from BARDA. So it's a great opportunity. Next is if you are looking for laboratory space for your startup, Lab to Launch, which is the laboratory space located in Health Science Research Building 2 or HSRB 2 at Emory University, is open and applications are available here. You can email labtolaunch@emory.edu to learn more. And finally, our next Bench to Market will be on March 20th at 11:30, and this is about building a compelling pitch. So today's talk is FDA regulatory strategy, and I am honored to have a super dream team of all the regulatory folks I know who all happen to be women. There's something about regulatory strategy that requires women. I don't know why. And so we really are blessed with a great panel today. And I'm going to let each person introduce themselves in the order on the slide here. So starting with Grace.
Hey everyone, I'm Grace Powers. I'm located in the Atlanta area, as I believe everyone else is. I'm an independent regulatory consultant. I worked in industry for 16 years before going out on my own. And like many others, help small and mid-sized regulatory companies with usually their first FDA interaction, pre-submissions and 510Ks, mostly US focused. My background is in biomedical engineering, so I actually started off in R&D before I moved to regulatory. So
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. Erika.
Hi, everyone. Erika Tyburski. I have a little bit of a different experience, if you will. Same biomedical engineering background, did R&D, started a company called Sanguina. We make diagnostic tests, in vitro diagnostics, and gone through my own point of care and home clearances, starting from an academic spin out, graduating with an undergraduate degree, going through that whole process with a company. At the same time, helped the Atlanta Center for Microsystems Engineered Point of Care Technologies with regulatory. And since the RADx program really took on more of a regulatory lens in my daily life in helping teams with their emergency use authorizations and now full authorizations. So I come from a couple different backgrounds, and depending on yours in the audience, can talk about what it's like to be in any part of that process.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. As Wilbur often says, you bring a really unique lens to this topic. Sandra, you are muted.
Yes. So I'm Sandra Maher, and I'm also an independent regulatory affairs consultant. I've been in medical device, especially more so in diagnostic industry for over 25 years. I worked in with a diagnostic manufacturer for 16 plus years, and then I moved and worked for a CRO where I was head of the IBD regulatory affairs department. And currently I'm an independent regulatory affairs consultant. So I do help manufacturers who want to put their product on US market, but I also do global regulatory affairs. And as Morgan mentioned, I am a part of the RADix group. So I do sit with the COVID-19 task force. So I help with COVID EUAs as well. So I do 510Ks, PMAs, pre-subs, whatever the needs are, you name it, I can do it. But I also write technical file submissions for global launches as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra. And last but not least, we have an actual visual of Cathy. Cathy, you want to introduce yourself?
The no picture person. Hi, Cathy Cambria. I too am an independent regulatory and quality consultant located here in the Atlanta area. I've got basically approximately 30 years of experience. I started out in a clinical lab as a medical technologist, moved into industry, and from industry went out on my own to do regulatory consulting, where I help small and medium-sized companies, love working with startups to help them understand the regulatory platform and the pathway forward. Yeah, and that's my story.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna stop. And so for the audience, we are gonna have a panel discussion now about regulatory. And this is going to be really diving into the great knowledge that's embodied by these four experts. And we're going to less focus on the sort of the specific training on the exact classifications and pathways. Three of these folks have actually done lectures that are recorded on that very topic. So we did one with Sandra last year, and we did one with Cathy and Erika earlier this year. And so I will post those in the chat. So that's really more about the pathways and the detail. So we'll talk about some of that, but I think more today we're going to talk at a little bit of a more strategic level. So I'm just going to start with the basics of regulatory strategy, which is and I'm going to go kind of round robin as I target the question. So if anyone wants to dive in to a particular topic, please do so. But Grace, you're sort of first on my my Hollywood square, so I'll target the first one to you, which is just an overview of regulatory strategy for biotech and academic startups. Can you give just a little summary of that for us?
Yeah, so for me, I'm mostly in the medical device space, so I'll talk a little bit about that. To me, regulatory strategy is kind of a high level of your regulatory plan and your roadmap for what is required to bring your device to market from purely like a regulatory and a submission standpoint. I always tell my clients that regulatory is one piece of the puzzle. There's other compliance activities, quality systems, design controls that are certainly related to your regulatory strategy, but at least with the work that I do on a regulatory strategy, it's focused more on the device classification. What classification is your medical device? What types of FDA submissions are going to be required? Also, what types of FDA submissions are going to be suggested? Do we have some unknowns about the device that we need to talk to FDA about, maybe through a pre-submission in advance of some of those formal submissions? And it's kind of a guidance for that and a review of coming to, those conclusions and why those conclusions support the classification of the device is kind of an overview. and others can
Got it.
chime in and add pieces too.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
I can add to what Grace just said. So the regulatory strategy is really, as Grace mentioned, just confirming the regulatory pathway. So if we write as regulatory affairs professional, when we write a regulatory strategy document, we take into consideration the product's intended use, as well as the markets in which we want to bring the product into. So, and we do that because we always want to think about leveraging the data that we're gathering, not just in the lab, but from a clinical studies perspective, because we always want to think about time and cost. So the regulatory strategy should take into consideration a global approach, just looking at, really where you want to go and where you want to market, but it also would take into consideration all the studies, not just non-clinical and analytical, but also clinical studies that you would need to get the product to market as well. And as Grace mentioned, of course, you want to confirm with the regulators in US, especially US FDA, if that approach that you're considering is correct, because you don't want to conduct the studies and then put a submission in and then have the FDA tell you they don't agree. So it's always good to get that feedback up front through the pre-submission so the FDA can see or hear what you're thinking and confirm whether or not it's correct.
Thanks. And we're going to touch on both indications for use as well as how those classifications can affect your timeline and money, which they can do so tremendously. I should also mention to the audience, if you've got a question, you can drop that question in the Q&A section, and we're happy to take that sort of as we go, but we'll also reserve time at the end for questions. And the other preamble I should have probably mentioned is that this group is very focused, as we are between Emory and Georgia Tech, mainly on medical device and digital health, but less on drug pathway and for drug regulatory pathways. So Cathy, if I'm going to turn the next one to you. You said you like working with startups, so I think that's perfect, which is as a startup, like when should you start to consider regulatory strategy? When should that start entering in your mind as you're creating your product?
You're muted.
And you are muted.
Thank you. I think that since you're entering a regulated industry, you always have to have that as your focus. I find that a lot of times with a small startup, they really don't know what the regulations entail, what they should and shouldn't know. So I think sometimes it's nice to touch base with a regulatory person early on, just to sort of understand that there are going to be requirements that are going to have to be met, but that in doing so, you also have to take into account where you are with your product, right? So you really need to have a defined product, and you really need to know where you're going to be taking that product. So understanding not only your product, but also the market that you want to enter and who you want your users to be, the end users. This way, that helps to give a better definition of what your product is and the regulatory path forward, right? Because all of that information is going to help to determine what the regulatory classification is and what the requirements are going to be to move forward. Better to find out early than later on.
Gotcha. And you know, would you advise people to talk to a specialist like really early, or would you advise them more to, read certain resources, come up to speed on the different classifications and pathways? Or both,
well,
maybe.
Right. I think, again, right, you sometimes have some people that are more interested in trying to find out additional information, and then you have others that are like, no, really, this is my focus. I'd rather just have somebody help me with those things. there are definitely lots of resources, even on FDA's website with CDRH Learn and other avenues that you can basically just do a Google search. Don't use FDA's search engine because it's really not the best, but do Google it. You'll get there faster.
Got it. Okay. And you kind of alluded to some challenges that people have. I shouldn't say challenges, but like hurdles at that early stage. Can you say what you've seen from working with startups, like what challenges they've faced or maybe stumbles they've made at the beginning parts of this process?
Yeah, I think that sometimes what you find is that with the small startups, they're so focused on their product that they haven't necessarily taken into consideration the market and how their product is going to fit into the market. And then based on how it fits into the market, again, what the pathway is going to be. So when you're looking to understand where you fit into the market, right, you want to see who your competition is, and understanding your competition will help you understand where your product may fit in the regulatory pathway, right? So if I've got a product that has an intended use that currently has another product out on the market, right, that's a pathway that's been defined by FDA. If I have something that all researchers love to use, new and novel, right, it may increase my classification due to the risk, and in which case then it's going to increase the requirements set forth by FDA. So understand that everybody's product is new and novel. Yay, love it. But be careful when you use the word novel, because it does look, it is looked at from the perspective of perhaps having more risk. And in which case, FDA is going to, if there isn't something currently on the market, is going to put you in a higher classification.
I think it's worth pausing on that. I think you should say more, or if someone else wants to say more about that, which is the posture you take when you're pitching your product versus the posture you take with regulatory can be very different. Say more about that.
I have a very specific example, which I think will address that. So I actually started working with Cathy with my startup company maybe 7 years ago. And I came in as the deer in the headlights, like, I have this brand new technology. It's so cool. It's amazing. It's so different. And I remember our first clearance on that project going to a patent discussion with the US Patent Office, where you have to make the exact opposite positioning that you take with the FDA. And the patent office is saying, this has been done before 100 times. Tell me why it's different, defend why I should give you these claims. So you put on that hat and you really have to get into the science on it's different. This is the utility. This is it. But later that week, we had an FDA either pre-sub or meeting with our reviewer, and it's the complete opposite. It's like, I'm very similar to the predicate. I use very similar chemistry. From a risk perspective, they are the same. And I think that's the big difference. So I think for new companies and startups, people that are just starting in the space, understanding that your product can be different, but you really have to put the context in a risk benefit mindset, because that's how FDA will be thinking about it. Okay, so if you tell me, ultimately, this test is going to show me a line that says that means yes or no, and that line is blue or pink, and people have used blue or pink for a long time. Your antibodies are cheaper or whatever it is, but they still ultimately result in a blue or pink the same way. That's a very strong similarity, right? Even though your technology may be different. So that's just one example, but there are different hats you have to wear when you're first starting out. And I got to experience this in a span of a week and come through it. And we did get our patent and we did get our clearance. So it was a fun exercise.
That's on both. Yeah, that's a great example. I'll even just add one more, a small one from Radex, which is that your pink line example is in almost all lateral flow assays. The rapid COVID test, they have the same color lines, and one product that we tested as part of Radex had a different color line. It was green, as I recall. And it raised all kinds of questions about whether people could see it. What about the colorblind people? Is the sensitivity difference? And so just that little teeny change that you may not think, is important can actually be important. You don't want to be different in that case.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thanks, Erika. Okay, this is a big question, which is just a brief overview of indication for use and how, what is an indication for use and how does it actually affect your regulatory plan? And Sandra, you're up next on my Hollywood Squares here, but if anyone else wants to take that one, because it's kind of a big one, you're welcome to.
Yes. So the indication for use is really how your test is going to be used. What is it going and who is going to be using the test? So I know we're still talking about COVID and we can use COVID as an example. So if you have a COVID kit in your home, and you look at the package insert, you will notice that we have what's called an intended use statement, but also there are indication for use. So that indication for use would talk about the technology, what's the chemistry, what's the mixture, but it will also talk about the age group that the test is indicated for, but also the setting in which the test should be used. Should it be in the point of care setting, such as the doctor's office, or should it also be used in the home for lay users in that type of setting? So really, initially we talk about the regulatory strategy. When we put together the strategy, we look at this indication for use because we want to make sure that all those things that I mentioned before are actually called claims, and we have to do the studies that would support those claims. So we have to do, if we're saying that the test is for patients from 2 years or older, then when we do a clinical study, that study must involve those people. So we can't go to FDA and say the test is indicated for 2-year-olds when we haven't done a study for 2-year-olds. And so on. And if we're saying the test is to be used in the home, then we have to make sure that we give the test to these lay users so they can use the test, so we can see how they do with the test, and we set up specifications to make sure that they can actually use the test accurately. So that's really what the indication for use is about.
Got it. And for the second part of that is really the core of regulatory strategy, which is, which different classification is your product, and then how does that classification lead to business decisions? So could you say a little bit about those different classifications, Sandra?
Yes. So the so the classification, the way the FDA classify product, and I know we're talking about US, there are 3 different types of product classification. There are class 1, 2, and 3. Product classification. Class 1 would be for products that are low risk, or mainly products that are what we're calling exempt, meaning we don't have to go into FDA with a submission. So we can basically put those products on the market just by following certain GMPs, and those tests would not require pre-market submission. But for class 2 products, which are moderate risk products, they usually require what's called a 510K pre-market notification. And those are moderate risk. And then we have the higher risk products, such as your infectious diseases, HIV kits, which are class 3, which would require a pre-market notification. So depending on the classification of your product, it would require you to set up what's called a quality management system, and it would be different based on the classification of the product, and it would take more resources or more work for you to set it up. because the higher the risk, the more documentation that you would need internally to support that particular product.
Got it. And maybe I'll just open this to everyone, which is, the timeline that you can expect regulatory approval between the classifications, and with class 2 specifically between a 510K, which is when you have something that's you have a predicate device that you're comparing to, versus a de novo, sort of a new device. Can someone say something about the timeline that it takes to get regulatory approval for those different classifications?
I can talk about it a little bit. So we'll start with the lowest risk devices, the class 1 devices. Often, not always, those take just an FDA establishment registration and listing and have some varying levels of other requirements like we were just discussing. So that's paying a fee to FDA within the first 30 days of putting your device into interstate commerce. So basically commercializing it or making your first sale. And that includes information just on the company and the type of class 1 device that it is. So there's no review by FDA of technical information typically in a class 1 device. All of the regulatory people on the line know that there's little exceptions to all of these rules, but generally this is the case. For those class 2 moderate risk devices, the ones that go through the 510K process. So 510K is the name of the submission to FDA. It contains technical information focused on just that product itself, things like the indication for use that we talked about, as well as testing. Maybe I don't work in the IVD space, so in my world, it's sterilization information, it's software documentation, cybersecurity information, electrical safety testing, things along those lines. I deal more with equipment that has that information, including that predicate device that they mentioned. So a predicate device is a legally marketed device that's been through the FDA 510K process most of the time that you're comparing against. It typically has a similar indications for use. So those, I guess, conditions or circumstances that the device is used in would be similar to this predicate device that's on the market. Timing wise, if you look at the FDA website, it says it's a 90-day review, but typically that's not what happens. It's typically 90 days that the FDA, I always say the ball is in their court, that FDA is reviewing that. There are times where the clock stops, you're answering questions, providing additional information to FDA, sometimes depending on how much how different your product may be. If you did pre-submissions or not, you may be doing some additional testing or updating labels. There's a lot of scenarios. I say usually 5 to 6 months, but there's a lot of information out there on product codes and how long things take so that you can look and kind of predict what you think it'll take for your company. And then class 3 products are kind of a beast. So they go through the PMA process. It has a lot of technical documentation associated with it. It has similar documentation to the 510K that talks about the product and all the testing, but there's a lot of other areas too. Typically, those devices require a clinical study. There's going to be a lot of information there. There's also going to be information on manufacturing, information on quality systems, probably multiple audits of the manufacturer as well as the clinical data. It is a truly novel technology. There's a lot of steps for FDA reviewing it and meetings and things to go through. And those typically, probably from submission, take a year or two to really get the full approval. So they take a lot longer and they're a lot more cumbersome and expensive. So feel free to chime in with any points that I missed in my chatting.
No, that was great, Grace. And this is a little harder to answer, but that's the time it takes from when you're submitting to the FDA. But even the sort of the preparation to submit, like especially for a class 3, you're having to do a lot of clinical studies that take quite a long time. So, anecdotally, I've heard, class 3 is like 10 years or something like that. So maybe I don't know if someone who knows more than me could comment on sort of that development process, if that's the classification that you're going for. Cathy,
I
I saw
can
you
comment
nodding.
on it a little bit.
Okay.
I worked for a number of years at what at the time was an Atlanta startup, CardioMEMS, that was a class 3 implant product, and it took over 10 years to get to market. By the time multiple years for even getting to the point of doing our IDE, which is an investigational device exemption. So to even do the clinical study, there is a submission before the PMA called the IDE for devices that have significant risk. This is an implant, that's significant risk. It took a lot of years, a lot of biocompatibility and animal studies to get to that point, and then a randomized clinical study that took probably 4 years after that with all the audits, and then a pretty lengthy review process, since it is a novel or was a novel technology still on the market today. But I would say overall, I said 10, but it's probably 12 years plus. There are some other and there wasn't anything like that before. And in class 3 products, you're not necessarily you don't have to compare to a predicate device or what's out there, but your clinical study helps you develop that indication and what you're going to be approved for. And that just is a long process. So.
Cool. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so I worked in the IVD space, in vitro diagnostic space. And for the class 3, they are a little shorter than the medical devices. We do use a reference that we compare to. So for the HIV kits and hepatitis B, the surface antigen and HCV kits that I've worked on, usually 3 to 5 years. The HIV kit did take a little longer. We had some requirements for a particular analyte and that we had to detect, and so we struggled to find those samples. But in general, for the 510Ks, because sometimes you are able to use banked samples. For the lower class products, the product development process might be a little shorter. But when you have to do the clinical for an IVD 510K, it does take a little while longer, 6 months to a year, if you're in the right season, right, Erika and Cathy? If we're in the flu season, for example, when we're ready for clinical, it could be pretty quick. But if we're ready to go, and for example, with COVID and flu, if it's not the flu season, then you may have to wait. And so it does take a little longer to get those samples together. So, for 510K, usually a year to 6 months to a year. It depends, or 18 months, but for PMA, usually 3 to 5 years, just for the product development process.
Got it. You want to comment on that, Erika?
Well, I think if we're talking timing, and I'm much more on IVD, so bless the 12-year process. But the difference between a 510K and a de novo is a big topic that comes up. And a lot of the times there's potentially a misconception that a de novo is always going to be vastly different and longer. We have a couple recent examples of de novos that have come out since the COVID-19 pandemic, and they are full authorization, so they're not really operating under EUA any longer. And there's certainly a push from both policy and the FDA's metrics to get fully authorized tests out there. So in the last few years, we have seen molecular tests that have made de novo status and gone through, not necessarily with that much more data, but they've gone through the extra pieces of a hardy risk-benefit analysis, clinical studies. So the biggest differences that come to practicality that I've seen is 510K, you may not have to do clinical studies. You may not have to provide FDA full risk benefit as part of your submission. For de novo, you do. And there are also a couple of pathways and categorizations within the de novo path itself that may shorten timeline. There's a breakthrough de novo path, wherein if you're a life-saving technology, novel, but really going to improve public health in a very fast manner, there's criteria. you could qualify for that path and you're given a shorter review timeline. And there's also, if you don't qualify for that, I believe there's another one called the STEP program, safer technologies, maybe safer technologies emerging, something like that, where essentially the idea is if you're a safer technology, something designed for public health, but maybe not as life-saving, or you don't meet that criteria, there's also a pathway there. So just a couple of nuances as you go through this. And again, I'm speaking from the IVD lens. There are some paths with de novo and 510K that can be similar in timeline. And alternatively with de novo, there's also the potential that there's policy that now has to go around a product code, and those things can take time as well. So just a couple other things on timing to chime in on.
Oh, thanks, Erica. You are next on my Hollywood Squares, so I'm actually going to direct the next question to you, Erica. Since you have gone through the process yourself, and then you're also consulting with people. I think most people start kind of DIY with regulatory. They think about it, they read on the FDA website, they come to webinars like this. And when do you think you should go from kind of coming up with this on your own versus hiring someone that may be on this call? When is that point in the development process?
Well, a few things from the startup life that I had to learn through experience is that everyone will have a small team to start. And you'll have some people that are developing, maybe you'll have a couple people that help on marketing and finance. But in order to truly do medical device design right, you really do need a design and development plan, which will ultimately feed into a quality system. And that even starts, your regulatory strategy is part of that in and of itself. So having the mindset that if I'm literally one person in a lab developing something, I'm going to need some sort of checks and balances to help me through this process so that I'm not blindsided. And I routinely see that. I see a single developer developing a product. They may be part-time, not even full-time dedicated to it. And they say, I'd like to get this through to FDA. It will take a lot more than one person's half-time effort to do that, likely, especially if there's a clinical to be managed. Ideally, you want someone from the technology side, someone from clinical, someone from marketing, someone from regulatory to put all this together before you even reach a design lock on your product to really understand who's going to use it, how. It was mentioned earlier too, but something as simple as how many steps are involved in the eventual use of this could drastically change what intended use you get. If you're having to pipette with a precision pipette, you're pretty much out of point of care. And a lot of people come to me saying, I want to be point of care at home. If it has 12, 13, 14 steps that are not second nature to a layperson, it may get kicked out automatically. So learning about that early on, I think is very important. And so I think it really depends on the person. If you know that, if you know a little bit about what you don't know, it's helpful than not knowing anything. And that was one of the big things that hit me. I was a single person working on technology, met Cathy very early on, and went through this process of saying, well, who's thinking about this, 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 and this? And it's just not enough bandwidth wise for one person. And then eventually when you're creating product and making it and manufacturing it, you really have to have manufacturing and who's doing quality control as two separate things, and probably much more than two separate people. So just thinking about that through, and then also putting a lens on it for intended use. And I can't harp a risk benefit analysis enough. Like, are you going to fill a need? Do you know what target you're looking at, whether it's a disease state or a type of user or a type of market? Because the worst thing isn't building a bad product, it's building a product that nobody actually wants or that FDA won't clear. And that's just a huge shame. So I think not being naive to all of that would be really helpful. And it really depends on the person. And I think interacting with that balanced team early on, regulatory as well as maybe someone in marketing and business, can shed light on that early. So you have that lens and you're really working through that during design.
Got it. Anyone else have any comment on that before I chime in? Basically, you said it so elegantly, but it's if you have someone on the team who's done it before, it seems like you could handle it in the team. But if you don't, you need to find someone.
Learn about it. Don't be shy. I mean, I think I was a Googler, so I eventually found a product code that I thought would fit, had no idea what a product code was, didn't know what an 820 prefix was, and just started diving in and learning. But, you know, from a scientific background, I think we can bog ourselves down in little details. So what does 82021 CFR mean without like seeing some of the bigger picture? And I think talking to those people who've been to it before, they can show you the forest and the pine needles, which is really helpful.
I love that. Never heard forest and the pine needle before. Cool. I'm going to move on to some case studies and um, really just I'm looking for an example of a company or a product that really navigated this process well. And Grace, you're kind of up, but I wanted to open this up to anyone if they've got a use case of a company or a product that they thought really went through this process really well. And could you say more about that?
I can talk a little bit about it, generally, not specific company wise, I guess. But I have a client who, reached out to me when I always say Cathy was talking about this before, like they knew who they were, they knew what their product was, knew it had a business case, and were ready to have regulatory strategy and talk to FDA. We ended up doing a pre-submission, which confirmed their predicate with no questions, which was comforting for them, comforting for their investors. They had a big like kind of a microbiology study that was very expensive and very long timeline. So we had the protocol and the plan for that as part of our pre-submission that FDA reviewed. And I always tell people, if it's a test you can only afford to do one time, if it's a really long timeline, something like that, maybe it's something that we do want to talk to FDA about. If there's something about that protocol and how it relates to your product that's not obvious on what to do, or just to get comfort on that. I do a lot of biocompatibility testing reviews, and some of those tests take 6 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you want to make sure that your protocol is correct. You don't have time or money to repeat it. And so we took basically their longest, most expensive protocol and put that in the pre-submission too, and got some good feedback that changed a few things about it, nothing major. But, then when we got into the 510(k) process, and it's still under review, so I don't want to talk about it, but we're almost there. There weren't questions about that because FDA had seen it before. There's always going to be little questions about things majority of the time, but some of those major pieces were, we checked the box on. So I feel like that's overall a good regulatory strategy. And then I've had the opposite scenario where they're like, we just don't have time to do a pre-submission. Like, we're just going to turn this in and see what happens. And then there's an issue with the predicate and the indication. And sometimes the regulatory consultant realizes that, but it's worth a shot to kind of negotiate through it to keep things faster. And it doesn't end up being faster in the end. So.
It doesn't sound like you've ever experienced that.
Never. So.
Never. Anyone else have an example they want to share? Doesn't have to be a specific company. I know we don't want to say the company name.
I think that the companies that go into this with everything we've outlined, right? You have an idea of regulatory and you have the right mindset. In addition, you're tracking what FDA is looking for. So you'll see solicitations that FDA actually sends out to the public for comment. They ask the industry questions. We're interested in artificial intelligence powered algorithms going into devices that may not be locked. That's a huge concept. But when FDA releases something like that and they say, we'd like industry to comment on it in the next 90 days or something, get in there if it's part of your field, right? Because sometimes they'll publicly comment back and say, well, we really liked this feedback. And I find that you're always looking at, is this worth FDA's time? I think that they have their own metrics and they're looking at getting the products out there that they really think that the world needs. So when we see things like that, which are really outside of the review jurisdiction that FDA has, it's a different responsibility to really think about what comes next. And you're, as many scientists I've talked to, they say, I'm next. I've got the next idea. When you can kind of align with that, I think it can help. So I again, not specifically with company, but a few companies that have taken the time to think about some of these topics and comment in, and then strategize when they submit to FDA, and maybe even try and target that department. I sense it goes well, and they can refer back to that public comment that they entered into.
It turns out FDA is also just a group of people. Thank you, Erika. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. So if you have a question in the audience, and could be general, could be specific. If it's too specific, maybe we'll have to kick it offline. But if you do have a question, you can throw it in the Q&A. And while people are putting their questions in, I want to expand on what you just said, Erika. So that was a little kind of a pearl of wisdom there, which is that the FDA often does ask for feedback. So, for example, I'm working on a project related to pulse oximetry, and the FDA just asked for feedback about pulse oximetry. And so they do that quite often, actually. So does anyone else have any kind of pearls of wisdom that you wouldn't normally think of when dealing with regulatory and dealing with the FDA?
I just want to add that when we submit a pre-sub, we want to make sure that document is as comprehensive as possible. We want to go through all the studies that you think you would need to support the submission in order to get clearance or approval or authorization. Make sure you include, don't leave any stones unturned. You just go in, all the analytical studies and the clinical study design should be in that pre-sub. Whether or not you think you know what you need to do, you need to send it in and have the feedback and ask questions so that when you get the response from FDA, you know you're on the right track, because you may think you know what you need to do and you don't ask, because it's don't ask, don't tell, right? If you don't ask FDA, they won't tell you. So you want to make sure that when you get the response back, it's exactly what you need to get the clearance or approval for the product.
Got it. And we should mention for the audience, a pre-sub in the lingo is a pre-submission, which is a formal process with the FDA where you meet with them, and then they don't tell you anything. That's a joke. Don't listen to me.
And it's also free. You don't have to pay for it at this time. So it's a good way to get feedback through the pre-sub process.
But it does have a 70-day clock associated with it, right? So you send in your targeted questions, and then basically there's a 70-day wait before you're going to either be able to meet with the FDA or get written feedback. Something else to consider, right, in your timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Morgan,
Right.
I did want to add a comment on the indications for use. For the benefit of the audience. I mean, I really do think that indication for use sets the stage, and it really informs FDA as to how they're going to view your product. So you really need to pay a lot of attention to that intended use with its indications. And the words matter, right? So when you're putting it together, all of those things have to be taken into consideration, that this is what FDA is going to be judging you by, and this is what you're going to need to support your product and its claims, right? So it's going to dictate like the types of performance data that you're going to use. It's going to dictate the requirements within your labeling. It's really going to set the stage not only for the company, but also for FDA during the review process. My 2 cents.
No, it's a good, it's a very, and I can give an example, I guess. So in our own products, we've created things for anemia, and this is simple hemoglobin determination. a lot of doctors ask for this for different things, but the use case that you pair with it and that you approach the agency with could have you move in a totally different department for the same analyte. So one example would be general hemoglobin determination may go to IVD, OHT, let's see if I get this right, 7, in CDRH. But as soon as you say it's hemoglobin determination in order to be a blood donation screening, now you're in CBER, which is a totally different, I mean, they are like a very large organization and also siloed. So it also changes where you actually submit, and based on other clearances that you've seen through for the same indication, how you might want to model yours. It's a very important thing. Small nuances should really be dug into.
Yeah, I'll add into it with an example I always use on my side is contact lenses, right? A contact lens, daily wear. So put it in, take it out, throw it away is a class 2 product. A long-term use contact lens that has to be stored, disinfected, cleaned, used multiple times is a class 3 product. And that really goes back to the indication on the circumstance that you're using it to determine classification. I mean, a lot of devices don't have the option to kind of be a class 2 or a class 3, but there are some scenarios where what you say, these claims and this indication drives risk level and classification overall.
Yes, and to add to that, for IVDs, if the IVD is used for monitoring, and as Erika mentioned, screening, or as an aid in diagnosis, those are 3 different indications for use. So it's important that the word you use in your intended use statement, that it's accurate, what the test is going to be used for, because all those different terminologies are reviewed differently, and they would require a different clinical study.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, coming from the academic side and writing grants and trying to talk to investors on how they can support me in bringing this product to market, we're so used to saying it can be used for screening or monitoring or this, and we start to use them synonymously, but they have very specific definitions and result in very different things to support your submission. I had to learn that, not the hard way. I don't think I had like a major upset, but that was a big thing for me to learn, because I'd go to pitch to an investor and say, I can use it all here, and then have a regulatory hat on and say, this is how it's actually going to be for my first clearance.
Mm-hmm. So Elena asked a question. This is on the same path. Maybe I'll direct it to you, Erika, which is wondering if anyone has practical advice on how to balance the FDA submission risk perspective and comparison to a predicate device with intellectual property, patentability, need to show novelty. Is it practical to manage them simultaneously? So I don't know exactly what the question is, but how did you balance those 2 perspectives?
Well, it didn't all happen in my head. I can start there. I had different team members, and even you start out with like 1, 2, 3, and you get to a certain stage where you start thinking about doing regulatory and patents seriously. Coming from the academic side, we followed a very traditional patent route. In fact, some of the people involved in my process might be on this call, wherein as an undergraduate student, I could take my IP and do what I want with it, or disclose it through one of my universities. And then I would work out a license back at some point in time with the university. So the university and I worked it out together. I disclosed using their resources and their patent attorneys to get my first submissions out there in the world, provisional PCT. And then as our company grew, we were at the point where we could then license it back and keep up with the maintenance. And that involves a partnership that's basically indefinite between the university partner and the company, as long as the company is marketing a product that relies on that patent. So there was that resource for a lot of academic projects. And I know with PhD, I think it's an automatic shared IP situation. I'm not the expert on that, but that was a resource that was available to me very, very soon, just based on how I spun out. And so having those people talk about it, and if your OTT, Office of Technology Transfer office, is good, they may be able to point you to specific use cases and specific products. So I actually talked very specifically about medical device use and the patent I was going for. So they had the expertise. So met with them early. you really, in my case, I just did it. I was fortunate enough to have funding to support me to work on these things and to learn regulatory, to learn about patent protection, to learn about these things as I was accomplishing things, which is not always the case. So I realized that's a very fortunate part of my story. Had a great team, and Morgan, you know, a lot of my team members, so, you know, a lot of right people, right time situation.
And Michael Tannenbaum from Emory OTT is here as a guest. So if you want patent and OTT help, you're a startup, you can reach out to Michael Tannenbaum. He is the man. Okay, this is a massive question, which we don't have time for in 3 minutes, but I'll just, Anonymous asked, our team is strong on device development, but we don't have clinical trial experience. Any tips for initiating a trial? I'll just throw out one tip, which is make sure you know why you're doing the trial so that the result is what you need for your submission or whatever risk that you're trying to mitigate. That's my 2 cents.
Don't underestimate your predicate or comparator. So be very clear. It's part of the regulatory strategy and process. If you're going to use this clinical trial to support an FDA submission, your comparator and all of the component, I mean, essentially you have to follow that comparator to its own FDA authorization to a T in order to use it correctly. I've seen some groups that, you know, say, oh, well, you know, our lab used saline instead of UTM, and that's not really on label for a comparator. That can, I think, Grace, you said it earlier, there's a problem with your comparator and how you're doing it, that could invalidate everything. And you're just unknowingly walking into a lion's den with that information when you go to submit it, and it may have cost you a lot of time and money.
Yeah, and I would add that your clinical protocol is going to be key. So you need to make sure that it's well documented, and that the data that you're going to be getting out of this is going to support your product and its eventual clearance or approval through the PMA. So documentation. If it's not written down, you didn't do it, right? That's one of the mottos.
Yeah, so I just want to say sorry.
Go ahead.
That the clinical trial also has to be monitored. So if you say you don't have the resources to do that, you have to be careful, because you don't want FDA to think that you cherry pick the data and that you introduce any sort of bias with the trial, because when the review starts, based on what you have and who you list as the monitor in the trial, FDA can come back with some questions, and there could be, you know, a BIMO inspection or, you know, some sort of red flag in the data where, as Cathy mentioned, you can invalidate the entire study. So you have to be careful about that.
Repeating the theme of hire someone who knows how to do this kind of thing. Thank you
Yes,
all.
I wanted to say that, but I know they said they don't.
You
It sounded like they wanted to do
that.
it themselves. Yeah, but I
Yeah.
was thinking, you know, it's better to hire a CRO or someone who really knows how to do a clinical trial in that case.
Yep. Raise money first, then hire a CRO. Thank you all for a wonderful panel discussion. I hope that was useful for the audience, a little less didactic. And I just want to say this is an amazing group of people on the call here. If you have a regulatory question, you want to hire one of these people, we'll put contact information when we send out a follow-up email. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.